content for my family and YouTube. I lived in Australia for a year, and these are all of the places I traveled to during that time. First up is Sydney, where I lived and worked for 4 months. It was probably the most expensive place that I traveled to within Australia and in general. My friend and I found a granny flat on Facebook to rent with another girl we met in the hostel when we arrived. We got jobs within walking distance of our new home and spent most of our time in the northern beaches.
Okay, we're at Girdler's in DY. So,
No, it's Coach Day.
Wait, mine looks so tiny.
although many people recommended we live in the eastern suburbs of Sydney or Newtown, we loved the laid-back beach lifestyle of our neighborhood. Number 2 is the Blue Mountains, which is about 3 hours from Sydney by train, and we stayed in a farm Airbnb for a short weekend trip.
Let's wave to them when they come close.
Next up is New Zealand. Because I was saving up money to travel, this was my first big trip about 5 months into the year. New Zealand is only a 3-hour and $100 flight from Sydney to Auckland. The activities there are pretty expensive and worth saving up for, but the accommodation on Airbnb is fairly cheap.
I know people hate when I say this, but sometimes I need coffee that tastes like American coffee.
This is definitely queen stuff. Number 4 is Perth. Straight from New Zealand, I flew to Perth, which was the most I spent on flights and accommodation for a trip. I was there for 2 weeks, and the flight is about 5 hours from Sydney. I stayed in a woman's home in a spare bedroom, which I found on Airbnb, and it was about $800 for 13 days. From Perth, I took day trips to Rottnest Island, Pinnacles Desert,
It's sort of like the Kardashian.
a wine tour, and even traveled south to Margaret River for a couple of nights. From Perth, I met friends in Tasmania for a week. Tasmania is a state of Australia separated by water off of the south coast. It's much colder there, and its size and population makes it really easy to rent a car and road trip around.
It's already recording.
Although we did not cover nearly as much as we would have liked to in 5 days because there's so much to discover here. By the end of that trip, I was traveling for 4 weeks straight, so it was time to get back to work.
Hello? Is this happening right now?
Magnetic Island.
We moved here like a week ago.
My 6th destination was Magnetic Island, which, looking back, was my favorite time of my entire year spent in Australia.
And they're really good.
My friend and I arrived at the end of February to start working towards our 88 days requirement for our second visa.
Benedict with salmon. What is this? Homemade beans and toast.
People on the island said it was expensive, but compared to my other experiences in Australia, I thought it was relatively cheap. Our rent was $400 Australian dollars less a month compared to our rent in Sydney. We really dedicated 4 months to living and working on the island, which allowed us to meet new friends, discover different parts of the island, and really get into the lifestyle there. But by June, I was ready to travel again because there was still so much of Australia I wanted to see, and Magnetic Island was a perfect base to do that. So 9 months into my year living in Australia, I visited the Whitsundays. This destination is only a 4-hour bus ride from Townsville, and I just stayed 2 nights in Airlie Beach to see the Whitsundays for 1 day. Number 8 is Cairns. Kat and I dedicated a week to exploring Cairns and its surrounding areas, including the Great Barrier Reef. After that, we drove to Port Douglas, the Daintree Rainforest, and Mosman Gorge. All around, that was probably the coolest trip that I did within Australia. My last Australian trip was a rodeo in Charters Towers, just an hour and a half inland from Townsville. I'd say that this was probably the most Australian experience that I had. Number 13, Japan. It is much cheaper to fly to Asia from Australia, so I took advantage of that by booking my dream trip. Within 2 weeks, I saw Tokyo, Fukushima, Kyoto, and Osaka. My last trip before heading home to the US was Vietnam, which I also traveled for 2 weeks. I got to see Ho Chi Minh, Hoi An, Hanoi, and do the Ha Giang Loop. There was so much more I wanted to discover of Southeast Asia, but I realized that I was running out of money and I was honestly kind of exhausted from my year of travel, so I'll just have to go back the next time I'm in Australia. All in all, I'd say 14 destinations within 1 year is pretty good, and I felt really satisfied with the balanced amount of time I spent living in a specific location, exploring Australia, and traveling to destinations outside of Australia. You can view more in-depth videos of these places that I traveled to at the links below. Guys, I just finished recording the audio for that and pulling clips, and I completely forgot like 4 more places that I went to when I was in Australia. I forgot to include Melbourne, Sunshine Coast, Noosa, and Adelaide, and the Great Ocean Road Trip. So that makes like 18 places.